In November 2002, 5 years after Diana died in a Paris tunnel, a man stood in the Old Bailey and watched his theft trial collapse because the Queen of England had remembered a conversation. The conversation had taken place in 1997, shortly after the funeral, when Paul Burrell had gone to Buckingham Palace and told the Queen that he had taken items from Kensington Palace for safekeeping. The Queen had remembered. Her memory, produced at the 11th hour of a trial that had been running for 11 days, ended the prosecution in a single afternoon. The jury was dismissed. The charges evaporated. Burrell walked out of the Old Bailey a free man. He gave a press conference on the steps. He thanked the Queen. He described himself as Diana's devoted servant, her protector, the man she had called her rock. He had tears in his eyes. The performance was impeccable. Within months, he had signed a book deal. The book that resulted, A Royal Duty, published in 2003, contained the private correspondence of a dead woman, the intimate details of her relationships, the specific conversations she had held with her butler, in the belief that the conversations were private. It contained things Diana had said about her sons, about the royal family, about the people she loved and the people she feared. It contained the kind of material that the woman who had described Burrell as her rock had shared with him precisely because she believed that the rock would hold. The Rock published it for a reported advance of £300,000. The palace had saved him. Diana's estate had defended him. Her sons had trusted him. The people who had believed, on the strength of Diana's own characterization of the relationship, that Paul Burrell was the person Diana had trusted above all others, had spent years of their lives and considerable resources protecting a man who was, simultaneously, preparing to sell everything the protection was designed to keep private. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He said, when the book came out, that Diana would have wanted the world to know. He said it on television, in the specific tone of a man who has decided that the interpretation of a dead woman's wishes is best conducted by the person who stands to profit most from a particular interpretation. He said it repeatedly across the promotional campaign that the book required, and the saying of it became the specific kind of statement that repeated assertion makes inevitable, not believed exactly, but present in the conversation, in ways that made its dismissal feel, to people who had not followed the details closely, somehow uncharitable. Nobody who had followed the details closely found it uncharitable. Paul Burrell spent 17 years as Diana's butler, her confidant, the man she called in moments of crisis and trusted with the management of her daily life. He spent the years after her death converting that trust into a commercial enterprise whose scale and whose sustained profitability tells you something about what the trust had actually contained and something about the specific character of the man who had held it. The palace called him a rock. The rock turned out to be something considerably less stable. This is the account of what was underneath it. Paul Burrell was born in 1958 in Grasmore, a former mining village in Derbyshire whose primary industry had been coal and whose primary culture had been the specific working-class culture that coal mining produces. Community-oriented, hierarchical in its own way, deeply suspicious of pretension, and deeply respectful of the kind of physical labor that keeps the lights on and feeds families. It was not an environment that produced royal butlers. It was an environment that produced miners and steelworkers and the occasional schoolteacher, and the distance between Grasmore in 1958 and the gilded interiors of Buckingham Palace was a distance that most people born there would never contemplate crossing. Burrell crossed it. The crossing required the specific combination of social intelligence and personal ambition that people from backgrounds like his sometimes develop when the ambition takes a direction that the background does not naturally provide for. When the desire to exist in a different world than the one you were born into is strong enough to overcome the considerable practical obstacles that the different world places in the path of people arriving from the wrong direction. He went into service. The decision was the decision that a certain kind of ambitious, socially perceptive young man made in post-war Britain when the traditional routes to upward mobility were either closed by class or too slow for temperament, and when the alternative route of royal household service offered the specific combination of social proximity to the highest levels of British society and the relatively accessible entry requirements that professional training could provide. You did not need money to become a footman at Buckingham Palace. You needed the right height, the right bearing, the correct willingness to subordinate your personality to the requirements of the role, and the capacity to learn the grammar of a social world entirely unlike the one you came from. Burrell had all of these. He was hired as a footman at Buckingham Palace in 1976, at the age of 18, and the hiring placed him inside the institution that he would spend the next 27 years navigating with a combination of genuine skill and characteristic calculation. He was 18, and he was in Buckingham Palace, and the distance he had crossed from Grasmere was already extraordinary by any ordinary measure, and he understood the extraordinariness of it in the specific way that people understand things they have worked hard to achieve and intend to use effectively. The early years at the palace were the years of formation in the most literal sense, the years during which Burrell learned the specific grammar of royal household service that no training can fully supply and that only daily immersion in the household's culture eventually produces. He learned how rooms were entered and how instructions were received. He learned the hierarchy with the precision that survival in hierarchical institutions always requires. Who deferred to whom, who had access to whom, which rooms could be entered without announcement, and which required permission that had to be sought through specific channels. He learned the vocabulary of royal domestic service, the specific way that the institution communicated within itself, the codes that people who had been inside it for years employed without thinking, and that people who had arrived recently were required to learn quickly. He was good at learning it. The social intelligence that Grasmere had not required, but had not eliminated, was deployed, in the palace context, with the efficiency of someone who had understood quickly that the intelligence was his primary professional asset, and that its development was worth the sustained attention that any asset worth developing requires. His early years at the palace placed him in the orbit of the royal family's senior members, without giving him direct access to any of them. Access of that kind was earned through years of service and through the specific accumulation of trust that royal households grant incrementally rather than immediately. He served at the formal occasions that a footman's role placed him in proximity to, and he observed the family from the specific vantage point that proximity without intimacy provides, close enough to see the individual people beneath the public personas, distant enough that the seeing was observation rather than relationship. The Queen noticed him. This is the detail that the official accounts of Burrell's early career at the palace record with a brevity that understates its significance. The Queen's noticing of a junior household member was not a trivial event. It was the event that determined the trajectory of everything that followed. The specific intervention of royal attention on a young footman's career that the royal household's internal dynamics made transformative in ways that no amount of competent service could have produced independently. She promoted him to her personal footman, a position of considerably greater intimacy with the sovereign's daily life than the general footman role had provided. The promotion placed him in the specific proximity to the Queen's daily operations that royal personal service involves, the management of the immediate physical environment of the sovereign's daily life, the small services that personal attendance requires, and the sustained daily contact with the person being served that personal service creates and that general service does not. He was in the Queen's household for several years before the event that would define the rest of his professional life and the rest of his public identity. In 1987, he transferred to the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales, beginning the association with Diana that would make him famous, make him wealthy, make him the subject of a criminal prosecution, and make him, in the specific assessment of the people who knew Diana best, the most complicated figure in the account of her final years. The transfer was arranged through the mechanisms that royal household transfers are arranged through, not by Burrell's unilateral decision, not by any formal application, but through the household's internal processes of personnel management, the movement of staff between the households of different royal family members, that the institution managed as a routine operational matter. Whether Burrell had influenced the transfer's direction, had indicated through the appropriate channels that a position in the Wales household was something he was interested in, is something the formal record does not establish. What the formal record establishes is the outcome. He arrived at Kensington Palace as a member of the household staff, and within the years that followed, he became the person Diana described as her rock. The path from Grasmere to that description runs through 17 years of daily service, through the specific accumulation of trust that intimate proximity to a person in need of intimacy produces, through the particular dynamic of a woman who was isolated in the most public way imaginable, finding in a butler the specific quality of attentiveness and discretion that the isolation made precious. He provided what she needed. That part of the story is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the character of the provision, whether it was the genuine service of a man devoted to a woman he admired, or whether it was the more complicated provision of someone who understood. With the social intelligence that Grasmere had not eliminated, the commercial value of what the trust he was accumulating represented, and who had made, at some point in the 17 years of the relationship, a calculation about what that value was eventually going to be worth. The calculation is not proven. It is not the kind of thing that can be proven from the outside, because calculations of this kind happen inside a person's own assessment of their situation and leave no external evidence until the moment when the calculation is acted upon. The acting upon began in 2003 with the book. The calculation, if it existed, had been running for considerably longer. What Burrell became in the years between the transfer to Kensington Palace and the publication of A Royal Duty is the subject of the account that follows, an account of a man who occupied the most trusted position in the most scrutinized household in Britain, and who used the occupation with a skill and a specific ambiguity of purpose that the people who trusted him most completely were, by the nature of their trust, least positioned to detect. Diana called him her rock. Rocks, in the geological sense, are the most stable things available in the physical world. They endure. They do not shift. They support the structures built on them across the years and the decades and the centuries, without the support requiring maintenance or the stability requiring renewal. The specific kind of rock that Paul Burrell turned out to be was a rock whose solidity was conditional, solid for the 17 years of the service, solid through the trial, solid until the book contract was signed and the advance was in the account and the calculation had been completed. Then the condition expired. Kensington Palace in the late 1980s was not the serene royal residence that its public presentation suggested. It was a household divided against itself in the specific way that households divide when the marriage at their center is failing, and the failure has not yet been formally acknowledged by anyone with the authority to acknowledge it. Charles and Diana occupied the same building and increasingly separate lives, and the staff who managed the household managed it in the awareness that the two principals they served had interests and schedules and emotional states that were diverging with a consistency that the palace's formal structure was not equipped to address. Burrell arrived into this environment and read it with the social intelligence that had characterized his professional development since Grasmere. He understood the household's dynamics, who was aligned with whom, which staff were Charles's people and which were Diana's, where the household's internal loyalties ran, and what the running of those loyalties meant for the specific character of service each principal required. The reading was not cynical in its initial form. It was the professional attentiveness of a man who had learned, across 11 years in the Queen's household, that understanding the environment you work in is the prerequisite for working in it effectively. Diana was 27 when Burrell arrived as a member of her household. She was in the specific period of her personal development that the years between the Morton Books revelations and the Panorama interviews confessions would subsequently make legible in retrospect, the period when the inchoate unhappiness of the early marriage years was crystallizing into a more specific, more politically charged understanding of her own situation and the institution's role in producing it. She was becoming, across those years, the Diana who would eventually sit across from Martin Bashir and tell 22 million people exactly what the marriage had been and what the palace had done. The person who was becoming that Diana needed, from the people around her, specific things that the Kensington Palace household was not uniformly equipped to provide. She needed loyalty that was genuinely hers rather than the institution's. She needed discretion that she could trust with the specific material of her increasingly frank private communications about the marriage and the palace. She needed the kind of daily, practical, attentive management of her domestic life that freed her mind from the logistics of existence and allowed her to focus on the larger negotiations her situation required. Burrell provided these things. He provided them with a completeness and a consistency that the other members of her household did not match, and the providing produced in Diana the specific response that genuine, sustained attentiveness to a person's needs always produces, a deepening trust, whose depth reflected the depth of what the attentiveness was responding to. The practical dimensions of his service were considerable and have been documented in the accounts of people who observed the Kensington Palace household during this period. He managed her correspondence with a precision that reflected both professional competence and personal loyalty, understanding that the correspondence was not simply administrative material, but the instrument through which Diana conducted the relationships that sustained her across the isolation of the palace years. He managed her schedule with the attentiveness that someone in her position, whose public schedule was managed by the palace's official machinery and whose private life needed a different kind of management, required from someone whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional. He was present at the moments that mattered. This is the quality that Diana's description of him as her rock was pointing toward, not the formal competence of the professional butler managing the household's domestic operations, but the specific willingness to be there in the less formal moments, the moments of personal difficulty and personal fear and personal crisis that the public Diana managed away from visibility, but that the private Diana had to navigate with whatever human support was available. The support available to Diana was limited in ways that the isolation of her position made structural rather than contingent. The palace's social world was not her social world. The people she encountered through the formal operations of royal life were people whose loyalties to the institution made genuine friendship with her complicated at best and untenable at worst. The friends she maintained outside the palace's formal world were friends whose connection to her was genuine, but whose access to her daily life was managed by the same institutional constraints that managed everything else about it. Burrell had access. He had it daily, as a matter of professional function, and the daily access gave him something that the friends outside the palace could not have. The knowledge of her that sustained presence produces, the specific understanding of her moods and her fears, and the texture of her daily experience that only someone in the same domestic world can develop. He was not a friend in the social sense. He was something that the vocabulary of royal household service had no adequate term for. A person whose professional proximity to her life had produced an intimacy of knowledge that exceeded the social friendships, and that Diana had decided, on the basis of the intimacy's character and his sustained demonstration of trustworthiness, was the closest available equivalent to genuine confidential friendship. She told him things. The things she told him were the things that people tell the person they have decided is safe, the specific private content of a life that cannot be made public without destroying the careful management of public presentation that the person's position requires. She told him about the marriage in terms that the public version of their relationship had not yet disclosed. She told him about the people in the palace who frightened her, and the people she distrusted, and the specific mechanisms through which the institution managed her in ways that she had learned to identify and that she found intolerable. She told him about the men who came after Charles, the relationships that sustained her across the years of the separation and the divorce, conducted in the specific privacy that a woman in her position required, and that the press's appetite for her story made increasingly difficult to sustain. She told him about her fears for her sons and her fears for her own safety, and the specific quality of the vulnerability she felt inside an institution that she had concluded, by the early 1990s, did not have her interests at heart, and whose management of her life was motivated by institutional protection rather than personal care. These were extraordinarily sensitive disclosures. They were made in the specific context of a trust that Diana had extended to Burrell on the basis of 17 years of sustained, apparently unconditional loyalty. The trust was not blind. Diana was not a naive woman who gave her confidence to people without the assessment of their reliability that her situation made necessary. She had watched Burrell across 17 years and had observed, in that watching, nothing that required her to revise the assessment she had formed of him. She had formed the assessment within the specific conditions that the palace provides for the observation of its staff, conditions that are not identical to the conditions that govern the observation of people in ordinary life. Palace staff perform within an institutional framework that shapes their visible behavior in ways that may or may not correspond to the character that would be expressed outside the framework. The loyalty they display is displayed within a context of institutional obligation that does not, by itself, tell you whether the loyalty is genuine or performed. The discretion they maintain is maintained within a context of professional requirement that does not, by itself, tell you whether the discretion reflects personal conviction or professional compliance. Burrell's loyalty and discretion, across the 17 years of the service, were maintained within these institutional conditions. They were maintained impeccably. Diana's observation of their maintenance produced in her a confidence in the relationship that the conditions of their maintenance had not fully tested, a confidence in Burrell's character that was based on his behavior within the constraints of service, without having been tested by the conditions that would apply once those constraints were removed. The constraints were removed by her death. She died in August 1997, and the removal of the institutional relationship that had structured Burrell's loyalty and discretion for 17 years was immediate and total. The person whose trust had been the foundation of the relationship was gone. The institution that had been the context of the relationship was now an adversary rather than an employer. The material that the trust had produced, the letters, the conversations, the intimate knowledge of a dead woman's private life, was now a resource rather than a confidence. The transition from resource to commercial product took 5 years. In those 5 years, the trial intervened, and the trial's collapse, the Queen's memory, the charges dropped, the steps of the Old Bailey, gave Burrell a specific kind of public credibility that his subsequent commercial activities would not have possessed without it. He emerged from the trial as the man the palace had prosecuted and the Queen had saved, the man Diana's estate had defended and William and Harry had trusted, the man whose loyalty to Diana had been formally affirmed by the people best positioned to assess it. He emerged from the trial with that credibility intact. He then used the credibility to sell what the credibility was supposed to protect. The book that resulted from the using was published the following year. It was not the last commercial use of what Diana had trusted him with. It was the first of several, conducted across the years that followed, with a regularity and a commercial acuity that the Grassmore boy who had crossed the distance to Buckingham Palace had clearly been applying to the management of the most valuable resource his professional life had produced. Diana had called him her rock. She had been right about the solidity. She had been wrong about what the solidity was for. The call came at approximately 4 in the morning on the 31st of August 1997. The details of who called whom and in what sequence in the hours following the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel have been documented with varying degrees of accuracy across the multiple accounts that the subsequent years produced, but the essential fact is consistent across all of them. Paul Burrell was among the first people outside the immediate official circle to be informed that Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead. He flew to Paris. This detail appears in the accounts of the immediate aftermath as a brief biographical note, but its significance in the context of what followed deserves more attention than it typically receives. He flew to Paris and he was present at the hospital, and he was part of the small group of people who managed the immediate aftermath of Diana's death in the specific, practical ways that the immediate aftermath of a death requires managing: the arrangements, the decisions about the body, the communication with the people who needed to be communicated with before the news reached the general public. His presence in Paris in those early hours placed him inside the most significant event in the British public's experience of the royal family since the coronation of 1953, and it placed him there as a participant rather than as an observer. The presence was genuine. He had been Diana's butler. He had been trusted by her. His being called to Paris in the immediate aftermath of her death was a reflection of the position he had occupied in her life. But presence at significant events is also, for someone with the social intelligence that Burrell had consistently demonstrated, a form of resource accumulation, an expansion of the material that his subsequent accounts of the relationship could credibly claim to contain. He returned to England with Diana's body. He was present for the days between the death and the funeral, the extraordinary week that the British public's response to Diana's death produced, the flowers and the crowds, and the specific quality of national grief that reshaped the monarchy's relationship with its subjects in ways that the palace had not anticipated and initially struggled to manage. He was inside that week in the specific way that the people closest to Diana were inside it, not as observers of the public grief, but as people navigating their own private grief within the very public conditions that the week imposed. He organized Kensington Palace during the week following the death. The practical management of a principal's household in the immediate aftermath of that principal's sudden death is a genuinely difficult task. The household continues to exist as a physical and institutional entity. The possessions remain. The correspondence that was ongoing requires management. The staff require direction. And the decisions about what happens to everything need to be made by someone with the authority and the knowledge to make them. Burrell had both, in the specific sense that someone who has been a principal's most trusted household manager has authority and knowledge in the aftermath of that principal's death that nobody else in the household quite possesses. He used the authority and the knowledge in ways that subsequently became the subject of the criminal prosecution. In the days and weeks following Diana's death, he removed from Kensington Palace a quantity of items. The precise number has been reported differently across the various accounts of the case, but the figure that emerged from the prosecution's preparation was in the hundreds of objects, which he took to his home in Cheshire, claiming later that he had done so for safekeeping, in the belief that items of personal significance might otherwise be dispersed or lost in the administrative management of the estate. The claim was not implausible on its face. Royal estates in the immediate aftermath of a death are administered through processes that can, in the absence of specific attention to individual items, result in the dispersal of things whose personal significance is not apparent to the people conducting the administration. Someone with Burrell's intimate knowledge of Diana's possessions and their personal histories might genuinely have believed that the items he removed were better protected in his custody than in the estate's general administration. Whether this was the actual motivation or a subsequently constructed justification for behavior motivated by something else, is the question that the criminal case was prosecuting when the Queen's memory ended the prosecution before it could reach a verdict. The items he removed included correspondence, letters, notes, cards, the written record of Diana's private communications that she had accumulated across the years of her personal relationships and that Burrell had handled in the course of his management of her correspondence. The letters were not simply objects with sentimental value. They were the primary documentary record of the private Diana, the woman whose thoughts and feelings and private assessments of the people in her life had been committed to paper with the directness that people bring to private writing when they believe the writing will stay private. They did not stay private. Some of what those letters and notes contained made its way into the published accounts that Burrell produced in the years following the trial. The making of its way into those accounts was managed with sufficient indirection that the specific letters were not reproduced verbatim. The legal exposure of reproducing private correspondence verbatim was something that the publisher's lawyers would have flagged, but the content was present in the accounts in the specific form of paraphrase and reported conversation that conveyed the information without providing the exact words. The information it conveyed was information that Diana had intended to remain private. The letter she wrote to Burrell himself in 1993, the letter in which she described her fear that she was going to be killed in a car accident orchestrated to make way for Charles to remarry, was made public in a form that produced a significant news cycle and a significant contribution to the conspiracy theories about her death that have circulated since 1997. Burrell had held the letter across the 6 years between Diana's death and its public disclosure. He disclosed it in a context that maximized its impact and its commercial value to him. The letter's disclosure was the most dramatic single example of what the broader pattern of his post-Diana career represented, the conversion of Diana's private material into public and commercial capital, conducted with a timing and a staging that reflected genuine calculation about what would produce the maximum return. The funeral on the 6th of September 1997 placed Burrell in a specific position, walking behind Diana's coffin as part of the small group of people whose relationship to her was understood by the watching world to warrant the specific proximity of the procession. He was visible, in that position, to everyone watching the funeral, a global audience of an estimated 2.5 billion people, who saw him as one of the people closest to the woman being mourned, and who absorbed, from his position in the procession, the information that he was among the people most legitimately placed to speak about her. The funeral procession was, among other things, a credential. It was the most public possible confirmation of the intimacy of his relationship to Diana, delivered in the most solemn possible context, witnessed by an audience whose scale would never be replicated in any subsequent context in which he sought to claim the authority that the intimacy conferred. He walked behind her coffin as her rock. He emerged from the cathedral as someone whose claim to speak about Diana was more publicly and more powerfully confirmed than any endorsement a publisher's cover could provide. He used the credential efficiently. In the years between the death and the book, he gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries. He maintained a public presence as Diana's closest confidant, the person who knew her best, the man she had trusted above all others. Each appearance confirmed the credential and extended its reach, building the specific public identity of the devoted butler that the book, when it arrived, would present as the authoritative narrator of Diana's private life. The devoted butler was not a fabrication. The devotion had been real, or had been real enough across 17 years to have produced from Diana the specific trust that the credential represented. What had changed was not the devotion's historical reality, but the use to which the historical reality was being put. Not the preservation of Diana's memory, but the commercial exploitation of the specific content of that memory, conducted by the person whose position as its custodian had been established by the very trust the exploitation was violating. He was, in those years between the death and the book, living in the specific ambiguity that his position created. The man whose claim to speak about Diana was most legitimate, and whose use of that claim was most problematic. The man whose devotion was most publicly established, and whose subsequent choices would most directly betray what the devotion had supposedly represented. The ambiguity resolved itself with the publication of A Royal Duty in 2003. The resolution was not, for the people who had trusted him, comfortable. It was, for Burrell, commercially effective. The Metropolitan Police began investigating Paul Burrell in 1999, 2 years after Diana's death. The investigation was not the product of a specific complaint or a specific tip from a specific source. It was the product of a broader examination of the management of Diana's estate in the immediate aftermath of her death, an examination that the people responsible for administering the estate had initiated when it became apparent that the inventory of her possessions did not correspond to what should have been there. The discrepancy was significant. Hundreds of items were missing from Kensington Palace, objects ranging from the personally significant to the institutionally valuable, from Diana's private correspondence to items that the estate's executors considered property of the estate, whose disposition was their responsibility, rather than the responsibility of any individual member of the household staff. The investigation that followed the discovery of the discrepancy identified Burrell as the person who had removed the items and established that the items were in his possession at his home in Cheshire. He was charged in August 2001 with theft, specifically with the theft of Diana's property. The charge was a serious one, and the prosecution that was prepared around it was correspondingly serious. The Crown Prosecution Service committed the resources appropriate to a case involving the theft of significant quantities of property from the estate of the most famous woman in Britain. The preparation of the prosecution was also, by the accounts of people involved in it, a prosecution whose complexity went beyond the straightforward theft case that its formal description suggested. The material that Burrell had removed included correspondence, Diana's private letters, her personal notes, the written record of relationships and conversations, and private thoughts that she had accumulated across the years of her adult life. The presence of this correspondence in the stolen material gave the case a dimension that a straightforward property theft case would not have had, because the correspondence was not simply property in the legal sense, but the primary available documentation of Diana's private world, and its location in Burrell's possession, rather than in the estate's custody, raised questions about what he intended to do with it that the theft charges alone did not answer. William and Harry were publicly supportive of Burrell during the period between the charges and the trial. Their support was expressed in terms that reflected their genuine belief, based on Diana's own characterization of the relationship and their own childhood experience of Burrell as a trusted member of their mother's household, that the man being prosecuted was a victim of a misunderstanding rather than a perpetrator of a genuine theft. They issued a statement expressing their belief in him. They were, in the most straightforward available reading of the situation, wrong. Not because Burrell had not taken the items, which he had, but because the characterization of the taking as innocent was a characterization that the subsequent use of the material in his commercial activities would comprehensively contradict. The trial began in October 2002 at the Old Bailey. It had been running for 11 days when it was abruptly halted by a development that the prosecution had not anticipated and that nobody outside the Queen's immediate circle had known was coming. The Queen's private secretary contacted the Director of Public Prosecutions to inform him that the Queen had recalled a conversation with Burrell in 1997, shortly after Diana's death, in which Burrell had told her that he had taken items from Kensington Palace for safekeeping. The information was passed to the trial judge. The judge summoned the barristers. The jury was sent home, while the implications of the new information were assessed. The implications were decisive. If the Queen had been told in 1997 that Burrell had taken items for safekeeping and had not acted on the information in the subsequent 5 years, then the prosecution's case, which rested on the assertion that Burrell had taken the items with dishonest intent, was compromised by the existence of a communication that suggested he had at least disclosed the taking to a person of the highest available authority. The prosecution decided the case could not proceed. The charges were dropped on the 14th of November 2002. The jury was formally dismissed. Burrell walked out of the Old Bailey a free man. The circumstances of the Queen's memory and its timing have been the subject of considerable speculation in the years since the trial's collapse. The memory arrived on the 11th day of a trial that had been prepared over 3 years and whose prosecution was being conducted by experienced lawyers who had spent months reviewing the evidence. It arrived at a moment when the trial's direction was established, and the evidence was being presented to a jury that had been selected and sworn, and that had been sitting for 11 days. The timing produced questions that the official accounts of the episode have not satisfactorily answered. Why did the Queen's memory surface on the 11th day of the trial rather than before it began? Who had known about the 1997 conversation in the years between its occurrence and the trial's commencement, and why had that knowledge not been brought to the attention of the prosecution during the 3 years of its preparation? Was the memory's surfacing at the specific moment it surfaced genuinely a coincidence of recall, or was it the product of a decision made by someone within the palace's senior management about when the information's value to Burrell was most useful to deploy? The official position on these questions has been the official position on most questions touching the palace's internal management: silence sufficiently complete to function as a non-answer. Nobody within the palace's official structure has provided an account of the 1997 conversation's known existence and its failure to reach the prosecution's attention that resolves the questions the timing produces. The questions have therefore remained questions, available for people to answer according to their prior assessment of the palace's management of inconvenient information. What is not a question is the effect of the trial's collapse on Burrell's subsequent position. He emerged from the Old Bailey with the specific credibility that only the state's failure to convict provides, the credibility of someone the criminal justice system had attempted to find guilty and had been unable to find guilty, whose acquittal was not a not guilty verdict in the standard sense, but was nevertheless functionally equivalent to one in the public's reception of it. He was not acquitted of theft because a jury found him not guilty. He was freed because the prosecution abandoned the case. The distinction is legally significant and was practically irrelevant to the public's reception of the outcome. He walked out of the Old Bailey a free man. and the press conference he gave on the steps was received by an audience who had watched 11 days of coverage of a trial that had ended without a verdict, and who were processing the outcome through the framework of the Palace versus Burrell narrative that had structured the coverage. In that framework, he was the loyal Butler who had been prosecuted by a palace that had wanted to silence him and had been saved by the Queen, who had remembered what the prosecution had forgotten. The framework was not an accurate account of what had happened. It was the account that the trial's specific circumstances made available to a public that was processing a complex institutional story through the simplifying lens that complex institutional stories always receive in mass media coverage. He stepped into the framework and occupied it with the efficiency that his social intelligence had always provided. He thanked the Queen. He expressed his continued devotion to Diana's memory. He presented himself as a man vindicated, whose years of faithful service had been confirmed by the very institution whose prosecution had attempted to criminalize that service. Within months, he had signed the book deal that a royal duty resulted from. The speed of the transition from the Old Bailey steps to the publisher's office tells you something about the calculation that had been running, that the trial's outcome, whatever form it took, was going to be converted into commercial capital, and that the specific form it had taken, with its drama and its palace involvement and its 11th-day collapse, had produced a commercial context that the book could be positioned within to maximum effect. The book was positioned accordingly. It was presented as the account that the palace had tried to suppress, the truth that the trial had been designed to prevent, the loyal Butler's testimony in defense of the princess who had trusted him and whom the institution had failed. The framing was not entirely dishonest. There were dimensions of Diana's experience that the book described with a genuine insider knowledge that no other available source possessed. It was also not entirely honest. The book's presentation of Burrell as Diana's devoted protector, motivated purely by loyalty to her memory, was a presentation that the commercial terms of its production directly contradicted. A man motivated purely by loyalty to a dead woman's memory does not sign a book deal. A man motivated by loyalty and by the commercial value of what the loyalty had accumulated does. Burrell was the second kind of man. The trial had confirmed his legal freedom. The book confirmed what the freedom was going to be used for. The people who had supported him through the trial learned this the way that people always learn the things they believed about someone were wrong, from the evidence the person subsequently produced, available to anyone willing to read it clearly. William and Harry read it. Their response, when it came, was not the response of men who had been unsurprised. A Royal Duty was published in October 2003 by Michael O'Mara Books, with an American edition following immediately through G.P. Putnam's Sons. The publication strategy reflected the commercial reality that the book represented, a simultaneous transatlantic release designed to capture the maximum possible audience in the minimum possible window before the legal challenges that the book's content was likely to generate could produce injunctions that limited its distribution. The legal challenges came. Diana's estate, administered by her executors, sought and obtained injunctions against the book's most sensitive material. The specific letters and correspondence that Burrell had reproduced or closely paraphrased in ways that the estate's legal advisors considered actionable. The injunctions were real, but their practical effect was limited, because the publication had proceeded and the copies already in the market were beyond the injunction's reach, and because the news coverage of the legal challenges generated the kind of publicity for the book's content that the injunctions were designed to prevent. The book itself was a carefully constructed document whose construction reflected the specific tension between what Burrell wanted to say and what the lawyers reviewing the manuscript would permit him to say. The tension is visible in the text, in the places where the specificity that direct quotation would have provided gives way to the careful paraphrase that attribution without reproduction requires, in the places where the account of Diana's private life is sufficiently specific to be clearly drawn from intimate knowledge, while being insufficiently literal to provide the legal basis for a clear copyright infringement claim. Within these constraints, the book was extraordinarily revealing. It described Diana's fears about the royal family, not in the general terms that the Panorama interview had provided, but in the specific, named terms of a woman telling her butler exactly which people frightened her and why. It described her relationships, the emotional texture of her connections to the men in her life after Charles, described with the intimacy of a witness who had been present not simply at the public occasions, but in the private spaces where the relationships were actually conducted. It described her sons. This is the dimension of the book that William and Harry found most personally painful, the disclosure of things their mother had said about them in private, things that a woman says to a trusted confidant in the belief that the confiding is a private act rather than a public statement, reproduced in a book available to everyone who chose to purchase it. Diana had spoken to Burrell about her boys in the specific, unguarded way that mothers speak about their children when they are speaking to someone they trust completely, with the honesty and the complexity and the occasional desperation that public presentations of maternal feeling do not contain. Those private communications about her sons were not Burrell's to share, they were Diana's. Her private assessments of her private relationships with her own children, expressed in the context of a confidence that the confidence relationship made hers alone to control. The fact that she had shared them with Burrell was the evidence of her trust in him, not the transfer of editorial authority over them to him. His decision to include them in a book sold for commercial gain was the specific violation of that trust that the book represented in its most personal form. William and Harry's response to the book was the response of men who had publicly supported Burrell through the theft trial on the basis of their belief in his loyalty to their mother, who had issued a statement defending him as a devoted member of her household, and who found in the book's publication the specific evidence that the person they had defended had used their public support as a credential for the commercial enterprise whose nature their support was supposed to be endorsing. They issued a joint statement condemning the book. The language of the statement was measured in the way that official royal statements are measured. It did not descend to the specific characterizations of Burrell that the circumstances might have justified, but the condemnation was real and was understood by everyone reading it as the specific response of two sons who had been used and who were saying so in the only public form available to them. The statement described the book as a betrayal of their mother. The description was accurate. It was also, for the people who had observed the trajectory of Burrell's post-Diana career from the beginning, a description that the evidence had been suggesting was inevitable from the moment the book deal was announced, if not from considerably earlier. The content of a royal duty extended beyond the personal dimensions that the coverage of William and Harry's response focused on. The book contained political dimensions. Burrell's account of Diana's understanding of her own position within the royal family and within the broader political landscape of the 1990s, her assessments of the specific people who had managed her and managed her out, the specific mechanisms she had identified through which the institution had limited her freedom and managed her public image against her own interests. These political dimensions were more consequential in certain respects than the personal ones, because they implicated specific living people in specific behaviors that Diana had described in unflattering terms, and that those people were now finding reproduced in a book, available at airports and supermarkets and bookshops across Britain and America. The legal exposures this created were real, and the legal responses they produced were part of the broader litigation landscape that the book generated across the months following publication. The Palace's response to the book was the Palace's characteristic response to things it found uncomfortable and about which legal action carried as much risk as inaction: managed silence, conducted through the usual channels of not commenting, not confirming, not providing the responses that would have made the coverage more damaging by extending it with official engagement. The managed silence was effective in the short term and was eventually rendered irrelevant by the book's own commercial life cycle, which concluded in the way that royal scandal books always conclude, with a sustained period of sales followed by a gradual diminishment of public interest as the next development in the ongoing story of the royal family displaced the previous one. What the book established, beyond the specific content that its pages contained, was a template. It demonstrated that the commercial conversion of Diana's private material into public and purchasable product was viable, that the legal challenges it generated were manageable, that the public appetite for its content was sufficient to produce commercial returns that justified the legal costs, and that the specific credential that Burrell's relationship to Diana provided was sufficient to position the product as authoritative in ways that the public would receive and publishers would pay for. The template was used again. A royal duty was not Burrell's final commercial venture into the material that 17 years of Diana's trust had accumulated. It was the first major deployment of a resource whose commercial life cycle he appears to have understood in terms that went beyond the single book, as a portfolio of material whose constituent elements could be deployed individually, in different formats and different markets, across a period of years that the public's sustained appetite for Diana content made commercially sustainable. The television interviews followed the book. The columns followed the interviews. The subsequent books, he published further accounts of Diana and of his royal service in the years after a royal duty, followed the columns. Each deployment used the credential that the previous deployment had reinforced, building the public identity of the man who had known Diana best, and whose continued presence in the public conversation about her was sustained by the commercial infrastructure of the Diana industry that had developed around her memory since 1997. He became, in this process, the most commercially successful of the people whose proximity to Diana had positioned them as potential sources of insider material about her life. He was not the only person who had been close to Diana and who subsequently made commercial use of that closeness. The field of Diana insiders who spoke, wrote, and appeared in documentaries was a field with multiple occupants, but he was the most prolific, the most sustained, and the most commercially successful of them, and the commercial success was proportional to the depth of the access that Diana's trust had provided. The deeper the trust, the more valuable the material. The more valuable the material, the greater the return on its commercial deployment. The return on Paul Burrell's deployment of what Diana's trust had given him was, across the years of the deployments, considerable. She had given him the trust because she believed he was the person she needed him to be. The evidence of what he subsequently did with the trust is not, on its own, evidence of what his motivation had been across the 17 years of the service. People can be genuinely loyal across a period of service and subsequently make choices about the material that the service produced that are incompatible with the loyalty they maintained during the service. The loyalty and the subsequent betrayal can coexist in the same person's history. What the subsequent betrayal cannot do is retroactively validate the loyalty. It can only be what it is, the evidence of what Paul Burrell chose to do with Diana's trust, once Diana was no longer alive, to hold him to the standard the trust had required. The standard she had held him to for 17 years. The standard the book abandoned in the first month of its publication. In October 2003, the same month that A Royal Duty was published, a letter became public. The letter was not new. It had been written a decade earlier, in October 1993, by Diana, Princess of Wales, to Paul Burrell himself. Burrell had kept it. He produced it as part of the book's accompanying material, deploying it in the specific way that a document of this sensitivity required to be deployed, not as an appendix to the book itself, where its legal exposure would have been maximum, but through the press coverage that surrounded the book's publication, where its impact could be achieved without the legal liability of formal reproduction. The letter's content sent the press coverage of the book in a direction that the commercial strategy appears to have anticipated. Diana had written, in the letter, that she was certain that forces were working to eliminate her, that a car crash was being planned to incapacitate or kill her, clearing the way for Charles to remarry and securing the future that the marriage's failure had made necessary. She named no names in the specific terms that would have made the letter legally actionable as a direct accusation. She described the threat in terms sufficiently specific to be credible, as a genuine expression of genuine fear, and sufficiently general to avoid the legal exposure that naming would have created. The letter's existence had been known to the people who had seen it in the years before Burrell made it public. It had been discussed in the circles where Diana's private material circulated among people who had been given access to it with the specific caution that its content required. It was a document that could reshape the public conversation about Diana's death, that could direct the conspiracy theories about the Paris crash in more specific directions than the theories had previously taken. And the decision about when and how to make it public was therefore a decision with consequences that went beyond the immediate commercial context of a royal duties publication. Burrell made the decision in the context of a royal duties promotional campaign. The timing was not coincidental. The letter's publication in October 2003 generated a news cycle that sustained the book's commercial momentum at exactly the moment when the initial publication coverage was beginning to diminish, when the book needed a new development to maintain its presence in the media environment, and Burrell needed a new element to sustain the promotional campaign that the book required. The letter provided both. It extended the book's coverage by weeks, generated additional international media attention that the book's publication alone had not sustained, and positioned Burrell as the person in possession of Diana's most sensitive private material, the documentation of her own fear that she was going to be killed, in a way that reinforced his claim to be the authoritative source on her private life and her private fears. The strategic value of this positioning was considerable and was reflected in the commercial outcomes that the letter's disclosure produced. It was also, from the perspective of the people who had been closest to Diana during her life and who had not been consulted about the letter's existence or its disclosure, a specific and significant violation of the terms on which the letter had been written. Diana had written the letter to Burrell. She had written it in the specific context of a trust relationship, the trust that had made her willing to commit to paper in the form of a private communication to a specific person, the specific content of her private fears. The letter was private in the most complete sense available. It was addressed to a single individual, contained information that she had not shared publicly, and apparently had not shared with anyone other than its recipient, and had been written with the reasonable expectation that the recipient's established discretion would maintain the privacy that the letter's content made necessary. Burrell's decision to make the letter public was therefore not simply a business decision about the commercial value of a piece of documentary evidence. It was a decision about the terms of the trust relationship within which the letter had been produced, a decision that the letter's existence was more valuable as public knowledge than as private knowledge, and that the commercial returns on its public deployment outweighed the obligations that the trust relationship imposed on its custodian. The decision was not made by someone who had been told by Diana that the letter could be made public. Diana was dead. She could not be consulted. The decision was made by the person who held the letter, on the basis of his own assessment of whether making it public served Diana's interests or his own. And the assessment produced a decision that served his commercial interests in a way that cannot be characterized as having served Diana's interests without a significant distortion of what serving Diana's interests would have required. The Stevens Inquiry, which examined the circumstances of Diana's death and was published in 2006, addressed the letter in the context of its investigation of the conspiracy theories about the Paris crash. The inquiry's conclusion that the letter expressed Diana's fears rather than constituting evidence of a genuine plot placed the letter in a different register from the register in which Burrell had deployed it. His deployment had positioned the letter as evidence. The inquiry's assessment positioned it as testimony about a state of mind. The distinction mattered for the conspiracy theory's evidential status. It mattered less for the question of what Burrell's deployment of the letter represented about his management of Diana's private material. Whether the letter constituted evidence of a plot or testimony about a fear, its deployment in a commercial context that Burrell had created and from which Burrell was profiting was a deployment that the letter's intended function, private communication between two people in a trust relationship, had not contemplated and would not have sanctioned. The question that the letter raised about Diana's state of mind in October 1993, the question of whether the fear she expressed was the product of genuine intelligence about a genuine threat, or the product of the psychological state that the marriage's disintegration and the palace's management of her had produced in her by that point, has never been definitively answered. The Stevens Inquiry addressed it within the limits of its remit and with the specific evidentiary standards that an official inquiry applies to questions of this kind. People who had been close to Diana during the period she was writing the letter have given accounts that differ in their assessment of the fear's basis. What the letter tells you with certainty is that Diana, in October 1993, trusted Paul Burrell with something she was not sharing publicly, and that she apparently was not sharing with anyone else. The trust reflected in the letter is the same trust that the book subsequently violated, and the violation of the trust is the same regardless of whether what she was trusting him with was accurate intelligence, psychological distress, or something in between. She trusted him with it. He kept it for 10 years, through her life, and through her death, and through the theft trial, and through the publication of a royal duty, and then he deployed it in the promotional campaign for a book he was selling for money. The keeping across 10 years and the deploying at the commercial moment of maximum utility are both facts about the same document and the same man, and their combination tells you something about the character of his custodianship that the promotional materials for the book did not include. The specific question of what else Diana communicated to Burrell in the years of the relationship, what other private fears, private assessments, private observations about the people in her life and the institution that managed it, and what Burrell has done, or might yet do with those communications, is a question that his commercial record since 2003 has given the people who cared about Diana's privacy every reason to assess with anxiety rather than reassurance. He has continued to speak about Diana across the years since a royal duty. The speaking has taken different forms in different commercial contexts: television interviews, documentary appearances, magazine articles, the occasional book, and each form has deployed some portion of the material that 17 years of Diana's trust produced. The deployments have not always been as commercially significant as a royal duty, but they have been consistent, and the consistency tells you something about how Burrell understands the relationship between the material he holds and the market for that material. The market is sustained by the public's continued interest in Diana, an interest that has not diminished in the way that the interest generated by most public figures diminish across the decades following their deaths, and that provides Burrell with a continuing commercial context for the material he acquired through her trust and has been deploying through the years since her death. He has access to more of that material than he has publicly deployed. This is not speculation. It is the reasonable inference from the known character of his relationship to Diana, the known extent of her trust in him, and the known quantity of material from the relationship that he removed from Kensington Palace after her death. The deployments to date have drawn on portions of that material. The portions not yet deployed remain available to him, in the same way that all resources are available to their holder until the holder decides to use them or the holder is no longer in a position to decide. Diana's letter about the car crash was a decade in his possession before it was deployed. Other material may be on a different schedule. The schedule is his to set. That is the specific character of the power that Paul Burrell holds over the memory of the woman who called him her rock, the power of the custodian who has not yet finished deploying what the custody contains. The British establishment's relationship with Paul Burrell, across the years following Diana's death, is a relationship that resists the simple characterizations that both sides of it have preferred to construct. The palace has wanted to present itself as the institution that correctly identified a theft and prosecuted it, whose prosecution was derailed by the unfortunate timing of the Queen's recalled memory, and whose subsequent management of Burrell's commercial activities was limited by the legal and practical constraints that a free country places on the ability of institutions to prevent individuals from speaking about their own experiences. Burrell has wanted to present himself as the devoted, loyal servant whose prosecution was a palace attempt to silence him, and whose subsequent speaking was an act of fidelity to Diana's memory rather than an act of commercial calculation. Both presentations are self-serving constructions that the evidence does not fully support, and the gap between the constructions and the evidence is where the most interesting dimensions of the relationship actually live. The palace's interest in Burrell was not simply the interest of an institution in the prosecution of a thief. It was the interest of an institution in the management of a person who had been inside its most sensitive domestic environment for nearly 2 decades, and who was in possession of material, documentary and testimonial, whose uncontrolled public deployment could produce damage that the theft charges were not primarily designed to address. The theft charges addressed a specific legal wrong, the removal of property from the estate of a dead person without authorization. The prosecution of that wrong was legitimate on its face, and would have been legitimate regardless of any other institutional interest the prosecution served. But the prosecution also served the institutional interest in establishing control over the narrative that Burrell was positioned to produce, because a convicted felon's account of the household he had stolen from is received by the public with considerably less authority than an acquitted man's account of the household in which his devotion to its principle had been affirmed. The palace needed Burrell either convicted or silenced. Conviction would have discredited the narrative before it could be produced. Silencing, through legal instruments limiting what he could say publicly, would have addressed the material without the reputational weapon that conviction would have provided. The prosecution pursued conviction. The Queen's recalled memory produced neither conviction nor silence, but the specific middle outcome of withdrawal without resolution, which left Burrell with his credibility intact and his material available. This outcome was worse for the palace than either of the alternatives the prosecution had been designed to produce, which is possibly why the question of the Queen's memory's timing has never been satisfactorily answered by anyone in a position to answer it. The timing produced an outcome that served Burrell's interests more completely than it served the palace's, and the production of that outcome, by an intervention that originated inside the palace's own senior management, is the detail that makes the simplest available narrative. The palace tried to silence Burrell and failed, insufficient as an account of what actually happened. The press's relationship with Burrell was the relationship that the British press has always maintained with people who are in possession of significant royal material, a relationship of sustained appetite for the material, combined with the specific editorial and legal calculations about how much of it could be published in what form, without exposure, that the press's management of royal coverage has always required. The market for royal insider material was large. The press had a commercial interest in accessing and publishing it, and Burrell was the most significant available source of the most significant available category of that material. The press covered him accordingly, with the specific mixture of apparent criticism and functional promotion that characterizes the media's treatment of figures who are simultaneously the subject of negative coverage and the source of commercially valuable material. Stories about Burrell's betrayal of Diana's trust were published in the same newspapers that had purchased the serialization rights to A Royal Duty. The editorial criticism of his commercial exploitation of Diana's memory appeared alongside the commercial exploitation itself, in a relationship that the newspaper's financial interests required, and that their editorial positions struggled to make coherent. The incoherence was managed, in the way that media incoherence is always managed, by treating the editorial and the commercial dimensions as separate operations whose coexistence required no explanation because the audience had been conditioned to receive them as separate rather than as the contradictory elements of the same publication's relationship to the same subject. Burrell navigated the press's relationship with him with the specific social intelligence that his career had consistently demonstrated. He understood which outlets served which functions in the coverage of his story, which ones were most susceptible to the exclusive placement strategy that royal insider material has always been managed through, which ones had editorial positions that made them more likely to present his material sympathetically, which ones had the international reach that the American market for Diana content required. He placed material accordingly, managing the coverage with the sophistication of someone who had absorbed, across 17 years in Diana's household, how the relationship between royals and their press coverage actually operated from the inside. Diana had taught him this, among other things. She had been the most sophisticated operator of the relationship between a royal figure and the press in the history of the institution, more sophisticated than the palace's official press operation, more attuned to the specific mechanics of how coverage was generated and managed, more willing to engage directly with the machinery of press coverage, rather than relying on the institutional mechanisms that the palace's communications structure provided. She had managed her press coverage through personal relationships with specific journalists and specific editors, through the strategic placement of material that served her interests, through the managed leaks and the carefully timed revelations that had characterized the information war of the Wales marriage's public dissolution. Burrell had observed all of this from close range and had absorbed the lesson that Diana's management of her press coverage represented. He applied the lesson to the management of his own, understanding that the coverage of his story was not something that happened to him, but something that could be managed. That the specific relationships with specific journalists and specific outlets were instruments of that management, and that the timing and placement of material were the primary levers available to someone who needed the press to serve their interests, rather than simply to report their actions. The palace could not control this. The legal instruments available to the palace for limiting what Burrell said publicly were instruments of limited reach: injunctions against the reproduction of specific copyrighted material, legal actions targeting specific disclosures that met the threshold for actionable breach of confidentiality, the civil litigation that the estate's executors could pursue on behalf of Diana's children. These instruments were real and were deployed with the legal effectiveness that the specific material they targeted warranted across the years following a royal duties publication. They were not sufficient to prevent the broader commercial enterprise from proceeding. They addressed specific trees while the forest continued to grow, restraining particular deployments of the material, without limiting the overall project of which those deployments were components. Burrell continued to speak, he continued to write, he continued to appear. The injunctions and the legal actions produced specific silences in specific areas, while the surrounding commentary continued without interruption.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
The most effective limitation on what Burrell could say was not legal, but commercial. The declining market value of the material he held as the Diana Industries' economic model evolved, and the audience's appetite for new insider revelations diminished with each successive deployment. The market for his material was large in the early 2000s and has contracted in the years since, not to zero, but to a level that supports a more modest commercial enterprise than the immediate post-trial years had sustained. The contraction was gradual and was managed by Burrell with the adaptive commercial intelligence that his earlier deployments had demonstrated. He diversified into formats that the book market could not sustain: the television appearances, the documentary participations, the international speaking circuit that the Diana anniversary cycles generated, and maintained a commercial presence in the Diana industry across the years when a less adaptive person would have found the declining book market terminal. He became, in this way, a fixture. Not a major figure in the current public conversation about the monarchy. The conversation had moved on to the next generation's conflicts, the next generation's grievances, the next generation's commercial deployments of royal insider material. But a presence, reliably available for the anniversaries and the documentary series and the interview formats that required someone who had actually been there. The palace continued to not engage with him publicly, which was the only available strategy that did not make his presence in the public conversation larger than it would otherwise have been. The strategy was correct and was consistently implemented. It was also insufficient to prevent the damage that his commercial activities had produced from remaining in the public record, permanent, accessible, available to anyone researching Diana's life, and finding in the accounts of her most trusted confidant the evidence of what that trust had been used for. The evidence is in the public record. It has been there since 2003. It will remain there regardless of what the palace's management of Burrell's subsequent activities produces, because the evidence is not a story that can be managed away, but a commercial transaction that has been completed and whose completion is documented in the royalty statements and the publishing contracts and the bank records that the transaction generated. He sold Diana's secrets. The selling is documented. The documentation is permanent. The palace wanted to control this man. The press wanted to profit from him. Neither fully managed him. He managed himself across 2 decades of post-Diana commercial activity with a consistency and an effectiveness that the people who underestimated him have consistently found surprising. They underestimated him because they read the surface: the devoted butler, the loyal retainer, the man in tears on the Old Bailey steps, and missed the calculation running underneath it. The calculation has been running since Grassmore. It simply took 17 years inside Diana's household to accumulate the material that made it commercially significant. William was 15 when Diana died. Harry was 12. Both had grown up in a household where Paul Burrell was a daily presence, not a distant institutional figure, but someone whose face and voice and specific manner of occupying the spaces of Kensington Palace were as familiar as the building's architecture. He had been there for their entire conscious lives. He had managed the domestic operations that sustained their mother's world. He had been the person their mother turned to in the specific moments of private difficulty that the public never saw. And the turning had been visible enough to her sons that they understood, without needing it explained to them, what his position in her life meant. When she died, their understanding of his position made their relationship to him specific in a way that it could not have been without it. He was not simply a member of the household staff. He was the person their mother had trusted most, the man she had called her rock in terms that both of them were aware of, whose rock status had been confirmed not in any formal declaration, but in the accumulated evidence of 17 years of daily service conducted in the specific register of genuine intimate loyalty. The trust they extended to him, in the years following Diana's death, was therefore not naive. It was the trust of two young men operating from the specific emotional position of bereaved children who had watched their mother trust this person completely and who had no evidence, in the years immediately following the death, that the trust had been misplaced. They supported him through the theft investigation. They supported him publicly through the trial. The statement they issued defending him was not the statement of people who had failed to think carefully about what they were saying. It was the statement of people who had thought carefully and had concluded, on the basis of everything they knew about his relationship to their mother, that the conclusion warranted the defense. The conclusion was wrong. Not because the evidence that would have supported a different conclusion was available to them at the time, it was not, but because the person they were defending had been managing the appearance of the character they were defending him on the basis of, and the management had been sufficiently skilled that the appearance had been maintained without their being in a position to look behind it. This is the specific harm that the sophisticated performance of loyalty causes to the people who receive the performance in good faith. It consumes the trust that genuine loyalty would have earned, and it does so in a way that leaves the recipients of the performance in a position where the discovery of the performance's character requires them to revise not simply their assessment of the person, but their assessment of their own judgment. William and Harry had trusted Burrell on the basis of their own assessment of him, formed over years of direct observation and supplemented by their mother's explicit endorsement of the relationship. The discovery that the trust had been misplaced was therefore also the discovery that their assessment had been wrong, that the person they had observed across their childhood and adolescence, and whose character their observation had led them to conclude was trustworthy, had been presenting himself in ways that their observation had not penetrated. The discovery was not immediate. It arrived in stages, as the commercial enterprise that Burrell's post-trial position enabled produced its successive deployments of Diana's material. The first stage was the book deal announcement, which produced in both of them a concern about what the book would contain. The second stage was a royal duties publication, which answered the concern with more specificity than they had hoped. The third stage was the letter, Diana's 1993 communication about the car crash, whose public deployment added to the content of the book the specific dimension of material that their mother had written privately to a specific person, and that the specific person had decided was publicly deployable. Their joint statement condemning the book was the public expression of a private response whose character the statement's measured language carefully understated. They were not simply disappointed. They were, by the accounts of people close to them at the time, genuinely angry in the specific way that people are angry when they discover that someone they defended publicly has used their public defense as a credential for the commercial enterprise their defense was supposed to be endorsing. The anger was complicated by the specific position they occupied relative to Burrell and relative to the public conversation about him. They had issued the statement defending him. The statement was a matter of public record, available to anyone who wanted to use it as evidence that William and Harry had endorsed the character that Burrell was now presenting as the authority for his book. The book's promotional materials positioned Burrell as the man Diana's sons had trusted, the trust they had publicly expressed becoming, in the book's marketing context, a form of royal endorsement for the commercial enterprise the trust had been extended to protect against. The circular quality of this, their defense becoming a marketing tool for the betrayal they were defending against, was not lost on them, and was not something they were in a position to address through any mechanism short of the public condemnation that the joint statement represented. The statement condemned the book, but could not retroactively withdraw the endorsement that the earlier defense had provided. The endorsement and the condemnation coexisted in the public record, available to anyone constructing a narrative about Burrell's relationship to Diana's sons that served their particular purpose. Harry's relationship to the experience of betrayal by people he had trusted is a theme that runs through the accounts of his adult life in ways that people who have followed his public statements have identified as significant. The specific quality of the betrayal that Burrell represented, the betrayal by someone whose trustworthiness had been endorsed by the person Harry most trusted, whose position had been built on a loyalty whose performance had been sustained across the entirety of Harry's childhood, is a specific and formative experience of discovering that the people you believed in most completely are capable of the choices that those beliefs had led you to think were unavailable to them. William's experience of the same betrayal produced a different outward response, less publicly visible anger, more contained management of the specific information that the experience had added to his understanding of the people who occupy the peripheral world of the royal family's household. He was, by temperament and by the specific formation his childhood had produced in him, a person who managed his responses to betrayal through the internal processing that his monitoring instinct had developed, rather than through the more externally directed responses that Harry's temperament made more natural. Both responses, Harry's more externally expressed anger and William's more internally managed version of the same information, reflected the specific impact of having extended genuine trust to someone whose management of that trust had produced the book that both of them found unacceptable. The impact was not simply personal. It was formative in the specific way that significant betrayals by trusted people are formative, not by making their recipients incapable of trust, which is the simplest and least accurate account of betrayal's effects, but by adjusting the calibration of the assessment process through which future trusts are extended. The people who are close to William and Harry in the years following the Burrell episode have described both of them as people whose assessment of the trustworthiness of people in their orbit became more careful and more specific in the years following the discovery of what Burrell had done with their public support. The adjustment was rational and was not sufficient to prevent subsequent betrayals. The royal world is not a world that becomes navigable simply through better calibration of trust assessment, but it was the adjustment that the experience's lessons warranted, and both of them made it with the intelligence that the experience's specific character demanded. Burrell's relationship with William and Harry after the condemnation was the relationship of people who had formally and publicly terminated a trust, and whose formal and public termination had not resolved the underlying situation, because the underlying situation was not a misunderstanding that the termination resolved, but a discovered truth about the person they had trusted, and discovered truths about people are not resolved by the formal acts that acknowledge them. He continued to speak about Diana in the years following the condemnation. He continued to be present in the public conversation about her life and her death. He continued to deploy the material that 17 years of her trust had produced. The condemnation that William and Harry had issued did not prevent any of this. It could not prevent it, because the condemnation was a moral statement rather than a legal instrument, and Burrell's commercial activities were legal in the specific sense that the injunctions against specific material had not made them illegal in their general form. The sons of the woman he had served watched him continue to speak about their mother. They watched from the specific position of people who had no effective mechanism for preventing the speaking, and who had already deployed the only public instrument available to them, the condemnation that had identified the speaking as a betrayal, without providing any means of stopping it. The watching was the specific cost of having extended the trust that their mother's own endorsement had made rational, and that the evidence had subsequently revealed as misplaced. Diana had trusted Burrell. Her trust had been wrong. Her sons had trusted him on the basis of her trust. Their trust had been wrong. The wrongness ran in the same direction and was produced by the same cause, the sustained, skilled, 17-year performance of a loyalty whose performance was indistinguishable from its substance, until the substance was no longer required. The performance stopped being required when Diana died. The substance had not existed in the form the performance had suggested. The revelation of the gap between them was, for the people who had received the performance as the real thing, the specific experience that Paul Burrell's post-Diana career has represented, not simply a commercial exploitation of a dead woman's trust, but the discovery, for the people who loved her, that the trust she had placed in the person she called her rock had been placed in something less solid than a rock, and something less loyal than the word she had used to describe him. The word stays in the record. So does the evidence of what the word was attached to. The British celebrity culture that developed across the early 2000s created a specific market for people who had been at the center of significant public stories and who were willing to convert their proximity to those stories into the currency that the culture required. The performed intimacy of the confessional interview, the managed vulnerability of the reality television format, the specific combination of revelation and entertainment, that the audience's appetite for authentic insider experience and the broadcaster's appetite for content with built-in recognition value together produced. Burrell was well positioned for this market. He had the recognition. After the trial and the book, his name and face were known to the British public in a way that the relatively obscure category of royal household staff does not usually achieve. He had the material. The 17 years of intimate service to the most famous woman in Britain gave him the insider credential that the market valued. He had the social intelligence to navigate the television environment with the specific combination of apparent candor and careful management of what candor revealed that successful television appearances in this category always require. He appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, in 2004, the year after A Royal Duty's publication. The decision to appear on a reality television program was a decision that the people who had known Burrell through his royal household career found surprising in a way that the people who understood the commercial logic of his post-Diana position found entirely predictable. I'm a Celebrity was not the format that a man motivated purely by devotion to Diana's memory would have chosen as the vehicle for his continued public presence. It was the format that a man motivated by the commercial management of his celebrity would have identified as a significant opportunity, a primetime audience of millions, a guaranteed news cycle, and the specific platform for the performed humanity that the format's confessional dimensions provided. He spoke about Diana on the program. He spoke about her in the specific way that the program's format required, emotionally accessible, apparently unguarded, providing the audience with the sense of intimate disclosure that the jungle setting and the format's removal of participants from their ordinary contexts was designed to produce. The speaking was managed with the same skill that his television appearances always demonstrated, calibrated to the specific requirements of the format while maintaining the consistent positioning of himself as the devoted former butler whose continued public engagement with Diana's memory was motivated by loyalty rather than commercial necessity. The program's audience received him with the warmth that celebrity formats extend to people who perform emotional accessibility convincingly. The reviews were not uniformly warm. There were commentators who identified the performance's character and who noted the specific incongruity of Diana's rock, processing his royal household memories in a jungle for a primetime audience. But the format was not one whose primary audience was reading the reviews. The primary audience was watching the program, and what the program showed was a man who talked about Diana with apparent feeling and who placed himself, consistently, in the position of the person who had loved her and lost her, and was now sharing the love with the audience that the sharing required. The reinvention that the television appearances represented was not a complete reinvention. It did not require Burrell to abandon the public identity that the book had established and construct a new one from different materials. It was an extension of the same identity into a different commercial format, using the same material in the different register that television required, rather than the written register that the book had used. The Diana credential was the constant. The format was the variable. Subsequent television appearances across the mid-2000s followed the pattern that I'm a Celebrity had established, the willingness to engage with the Diana material in formats whose commercial terms were transparent and whose transparency did not appear to reduce the format's effectiveness at producing the specific audience engagement that the Diana content generated. He appeared in documentaries about Diana that used his interviews as the authority-establishing element. The man who had been there, whose presence on screen served the documentary's claim to authenticity, regardless of whether the specific content of his contributions added to what the audience already knew. The documentary's use of him reflected the specific commercial logic of the Diana documentary genre, a genre that was sustained, across the decades following her death, by the combination of the anniversary cycles that generated periodic editorial justification for new Diana content, and the audience appetite for new perspectives on a story whose essential elements were known, but whose intimate dimensions remained partially unexplored. Burrell's participation in this genre was valued not primarily for the specific new information he provided. The information had been substantially deployed through the book, but for the credential his presence established, the signal that this documentary had access to the source, and therefore had a claim on the audience's attention that a documentary without that access would not have had. He was used in this way across multiple productions and across multiple broadcast territories: the British market, the American market, the international market for Diana content that the global scale of the public grief in 1997 had produced, and that the subsequent decades of anniversaries and revelations and royal family developments had sustained. Each territory's market for Diana material had specific characteristics that the producers and broadcasters operating in it understood, and that Burrell's management of his commercial presence across those markets reflected. The American market was particularly significant. Diana's public image in the United States had a specific character, slightly different from the British character, inflected by the specific ways that American media had covered her across the years of the marriage and its dissolution, and oriented toward the elements of her story that resonated with an American audience whose relationship to the British monarchy was simultaneously fascinated and external. Burrell's American appearances reflected this, calibrated to the specific dimensions of the story that the American audience's particular appetite required, with the palace's institutional management of Diana receiving more emphasis in the American context than in the British one. Because the institutional story translated into the American vocabulary of celebrity and establishment power more directly than the specifically British dimensions of the narrative. He gave interviews to American broadcasters with the regularity that the American market's appetite for the material warranted. Barbara Walters, in particular, provided him with the specific American interview format that his story's dimensions most naturally occupied, the sympathetic, probing, emotionally accessible format that Walters had developed across decades of celebrity interviewing, and that produced, in its Diana-related applications, the specific kind of intimate disclosure that the American audience received as authoritative. The reinvention that these years represented was not ultimately successful in the terms that a complete reinvention requires. A complete reinvention requires the construction of a new public identity that displaces the previous one, that makes the audience's primary association with the person being reinvented the new identity rather than the old one. Burrell's television and documentary appearances across the mid-2000s did not produce this. They produced an extension of the existing identity into new formats, which maintained the existing public understanding of who he was and what his significance consisted of, without adding the new dimension that a genuine reinvention would have required. He remained, at the end of the television years as at their beginning, the man who had been Diana's butler and who was selling that relationship's contents in successive commercial formats. The format changed. The identity and the specific judgment that the public and the people close to Diana's memory had formed about the identity did not change. The people who had been closest to Diana, the friends, the family, the people whose relationships with her had predated Burrell's arrival at Kensington Palace, and whose knowledge of her had been formed in contexts outside the butler-principal relationship, maintained their assessment of what his commercial career represented, with the same consistency that the career's successive deployments had confirmed. Their assessment was not always publicly expressed, because the people closest to Diana had their own reasons for managing their public engagement with the Burrell narrative, and not all of those reasons supported the sustained public criticism that the sustained commercial enterprise warranted. What did occasionally reach the public record was the specific frustration of people who had known Diana with the specific character that the television appearances projected, a frustration with the way that the performed intimacy of the confessional format was being used to construct a version of Diana that served Burrell's narrative rather than her own, whose emotional texture was calibrated to the requirements of the format rather than to the actual texture of the woman being described. Diana had not been a simple person. The versions of her that Burrell's television appearances produced were versions whose simplicity served the emotional requirements of the formats that contained them. The devoted princess, the suffering wife, the woman whose greatness was visible to the man who had served her and whose serving had given him the authority to represent that greatness to the audiences that the formats delivered. The simplicity was the format's requirement and the commercial product's asset. It was not the person. The person was more complicated. The people who had known the person knew this. Burrell had known it too, had known it across 17 years of the specific daily knowledge that intimate proximity to a complicated person produces. The simplification of the television years was therefore not ignorance. It was the specific commercial decision to present the version of Diana that the market was prepared to pay for, rather than the version that 17 years of knowing her had produced. The market was prepared to pay for the simpler version. It always is. He provided it. Across the television years and beyond them, he continued to provide it. In whatever format the market's current appetite indicated was the most commercially efficient vehicle for the delivery. That delivery is still ongoing. The market for it has contracted from its peak. The delivery has not stopped. Diana's death created a market. This statement is uncomfortable in the way that accurate statements about the intersection of grief and commerce are always uncomfortable. It implies a calculation where only feeling should exist, a supply and demand dynamic where only mourning should operate. The discomfort does not make the statement less accurate. Diana's death created a market for Diana content whose scale, sustained duration, and commercial sophistication represent one of the most significant media and publishing phenomena of the late 20th and early 21st century, and Paul Burrell is among the most successful operators within that market. The market structure is organized around the anniversary cycle that Diana's death established. Each significant anniversary, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, generates a predictable editorial demand for Diana content across the British and international media. The demand is generated by the combination of the public's sustained emotional investment in Diana's story and the media's understanding that Diana content reliably produces the audience engagement that its commercial model requires. Editors know this, broadcasters know this, publishers know this. The people who are positioned to supply the content that the demand produces know it too. Burrell knows it most precisely of all the people in that last category, because his commercial career across the decades since Diana's death has been calibrated to this cycle with a precision that reflects genuine understanding of the market's mechanics. The anniversary years are the years when his commercial activity intensifies, when the interviews multiply, when the documentary participations cluster, when the magazine features and the newspaper columns and the television appearances accumulate with a frequency that contrasts with the relative quiet of the intervening years. The contrast is the market's structure made visible. He is not speaking about Diana continuously because the commercial returns on continuous speaking diminish rapidly as the audience becomes saturated and moves on to the next story. He is speaking about Diana at intervals timed to the editorial calendar that the anniversary cycle produces, because the returns on speaking at those intervals are sustained by the editorial demand that the cycle generates. This is not a secret. The commercial logic of the Diana industry's anniversary cycle is understood by everyone who operates within it, including the journalists and broadcasters who generate the demand by commissioning the content. The mutual understanding does not produce mutual discomfort. It produces mutual commercial accommodation of the specific kind that well-established content markets generate, when the supply and demand sides understand each other's requirements sufficiently well to meet them efficiently. Burrell's efficiency at meeting the market's requirements across the anniversary cycles has been remarkable by the standards available for assessing it. The 20th anniversary in 2017 2 decades after the crash in Paris, generated a volume of Diana content across British and international media that required significant quantities of insider material and authoritative insider voices to sustain. He was among the most prominent of those voices, present in the coverage with a frequency and a range across formats that reflected both the scale of the editorial demand and his own commercial preparedness to meet it. The preparedness involved the advanced management of his positioning relative to the anniversary, the cultivation of relationships with producers and editors in the months before the anniversary that ensured his participation in the projects whose production timelines required advance commitment, the management of which projects to participate in and which to decline, based on the specific commercial terms and the specific editorial contexts that the projects represented. These are the practices of someone operating in a content market with professional sophistication, not the practices of a man whose primary motivation is the preservation of a dead woman's memory. The sophistication is not in itself evidence of bad faith. Professional management of commercial participation in a content market is entirely compatible with the existence of genuine feelings about the subject matter. What it is evidence of is the character of the enterprise, a commercial enterprise, managed commercially, whose commercial returns are the primary measure of its success. The 20th anniversary was also the moment when William and Harry made their most extensive public engagement with the question of their mother's legacy and their own experience of grief. Their BBC documentary, Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, was released in the anniversary year and was received as the most intimate account of Diana that the people closest to her had produced since her death. It was an account of a mother, not an account of a royal figure, specific, personal, clearly drawn from the direct emotional knowledge of the two men who had been her sons, and who were, 2 decades on, sharing something of that knowledge for the first time in this specific public form. The documentary occupied a different register from Burrell's anniversary contributions. It occupied the register of people who had known Diana in the specific way that sons know their mothers, from the inside, from the emotional core of a relationship whose intimacy is not the intimacy of service, but the intimacy of blood and daily love. The specific quality of that knowledge, and the specific quality of the documentary's rendering of it, was distinguishable from the quality of Burrell's renderings in a way that the audience absorbed without necessarily articulating. The difference between being told about someone by someone who loved them and being told about someone by someone who served them, managed them, and is now selling what the managing produced. The distinction is not absolute. Service, conducted across 17 years with genuine attention and genuine care, produces a knowledge of the person served that is different in kind from the knowledge that blood produces, but is not therefore less genuine. Burrell's knowledge of Diana was real. The question that his commercial career has consistently raised is not whether the knowledge was real, but what the deployment of that knowledge in commercial contexts represents about the character of the person doing the deploying. The Diana industry's 20th anniversary also brought into sharper focus the question of what Burrell had not yet deployed from the material his relationship to Diana had produced. The anniversary coverage generated considerable new material: the William and Harry documentary, the interviews with people who had been close to Diana in ways that previous coverage had not captured, the opening of archival sources that the passage of time had made available. But the coverage also highlighted the gaps, the things about Diana's private life and private communications that remained undisclosed, and that the existing sources, however extensive, had not addressed. Burrell was the person most likely to be in possession of material that addressed those gaps. He had been the custodian of Diana's private correspondence. He had been present for the private conversations that the correspondence had accompanied. The deployments he had made across the preceding 2 decades had drawn on portions of that material, but they had not exhausted it. The scale of what he had removed from Kensington Palace in 1997, and the character of the material it contained, made exhaustion through the deployments that had occurred to that point implausible. What remained undeployed remained commercially available. The commercial availability was understood by the people who worked in the Diana industry, by the publishers who assessed book proposals, by the producers who commissioned documentary projects, by the editors who commissioned anniversary features, as a reservoir of potential future content whose eventual deployment would be timed according to the commercial logic that had governed the previous deployments. The reservoirs of undeployed material that significant historical figures leave behind are not unusual. The archives of the important dead are full of material that the archivists and the estates and the literary executors manage according to their own assessment of the appropriate timing and the appropriate contexts for disclosure. What distinguishes Burrell's management of Diana's undeployed material from the management of a typical literary archive is the absence of any institutional or legal mechanism for ensuring that the material's deployment is governed by the interests of the people whose material it is, rather than the interests of the person deploying it. Diana's estate has sought, through legal instruments, to limit the most egregious deployments. The injunctions against specific material have produced specific restraints on specific disclosures. They have not produced, and were never going to produce, given the legal complexity of restraining someone's testimony about their own experience, a comprehensive limitation on what Burrell can say about the relationship and the woman at its center. The comprehensive limitation that would have protected Diana's private communications most effectively was the limitation that the relationship's terms had always implied. The understanding that what a person tells their most trusted confidant is not a commercial resource to be deployed at the confidant's discretion, but a private communication whose privacy the trust relationship was designed to protect. That limitation, for Paul Burrell, expired with Diana, or had never existed in the form the trust had required it to exist in, or had existed and had been overridden by the commercial assessment that the material's value made the override worthwhile. Which of these three possibilities is accurate is a question about the interior of a man's character at a specific moment in the development of his relationship to his own commercial interests. A question that cannot be answered from the outside with the certainty that the inside would provide. What can be answered from the outside with the certainty that 2 decades of commercial activity provides is that the override occurred. The private communications of a woman who trusted him with them have been commercially deployed. The deployment has been profitable. The profit has been sustained across multiple formats and multiple decades. The sustainability reflects the professional management of a commercial enterprise rather than the accidental consequence of a one-time decision. He built a business on Diana's trust. The business is still operating. The question of what Paul Burrell actually knew, as distinct from what he has chosen to disclose, and as distinct from what he has implied knowing without specifying, is the question that the people who study Diana's life and legacy have found most difficult to answer with confidence. The difficulty is structural rather than evidentiary. The answer to the question depends on the complete account of what Diana told him, and the complete account of what Diana told him is not available, because the person who told him things is dead, and the person who was told has disclosed only selected portions of what the telling produced. The selected portions are substantial. They include the contents of a royal duty and the subsequent books. They include the television interviews and the documentary appearances and the magazine features across 2 decades of commercial engagement with the Diana material. They include the letter about the car crash and the various specific pieces of correspondence and reported conversation that have made their way into the public record through the commercial mechanisms that Burrell has used to deploy them. The selected portions do not include everything. They cannot include everything because the commercial logic that has governed the deployments is the logic of managed scarcity, the understanding that a resource deployed completely in a single transaction is a resource depleted, while a resource deployed selectively across multiple transactions is a resource extended. The non-deployed portions are the reserve that sustains the enterprise's future commercial potential, and their non-deployment is the commercial decision that maintains their value. What the non-deployed portions likely contain can be inferred, with reasonable accuracy, from the known character of Diana's relationship to Burrell and from the known character of what she communicated to the people she trusted most. Diana was a woman who thought carefully about the world she lived in and who spoke with genuine specificity to the people she trusted about what she observed. The specificity of her communications to Andrew Morton, whose book, My Own Story, was published in 1992 and was based on tape-recorded conversations with Diana, gives some indication of the character of what her private communications contained when she was speaking to someone she had decided to trust with her full account. The Morton tapes produced a book whose revelations were sufficient to produce a constitutional crisis. Diana's communications to Morton were specific, named, and politically charged in ways that the book's publication made apparent, and that the palace's response confirmed. She named people who had failed her. She described specific incidents of institutional cruelty. She gave the kind of account that someone gives when they have decided that the person they are talking to can be trusted with what they actually think, rather than with the managed version of what they think that public communications require. Burrell had access to the same Diana that Morton had accessed in 1991 and 1992, and to the Diana who existed across the decade after the Morton book, across the Panorama interview, across the divorce and the years of post-royal life, in which Diana's political intelligence and her analysis of her own situation had developed beyond what the Morton book had captured. The Diana who existed in 1996 and 1997, in the final 2 years of her life, was a Diana who had spent 6 years since the Morton book developing, refining, and extending her understanding of the institution she had been part of and the people who had managed her within it. She had been speaking to Burrell throughout those 6 years. The communications she had made to him were the communications of someone who had not stopped processing what had happened to her, and who had, in the trusted space of the relationship, articulated that processing with the specificity that private trusted speech permits. The contents of that processing, the analysis, the names, the specific incidents, the specific assessments, are the non-deployed portions of what Burrell knows. The specific people she had assessed in that period include people who are still alive and still in positions of public significance. The British establishment of the 1990s is not a historical artifact. Its senior members were in their 40s and 50s at the time of Diana's death and are in their 60s, 70s and 80s now. Diana's specific assessments of those specific people, delivered to Burrell in the trusted register of private speech, concern living individuals whose reputations the assessment's disclosure would affect in ways that the individuals themselves have a continuing interest in preventing. This is the specific reason why the non-deployed portions of what Burrell knows have not been deployed. Not primarily because Burrell has decided against deploying them on ethical grounds, but because the legal exposure that deploying them would create is qualitatively different from the legal exposure that the deployed portions created. The deployed portions were manageable within the legal frameworks that the book's publishers and Burrell's legal advisors had assessed. The non-deployed portions may not be manageable within those frameworks, may name living people in ways that meet the threshold for defamation or for the specific legal protections that the English law of confidence provides for private communications. The legal constraints are real and are binding, and they are doing work in the management of what Burrell has disclosed that the ethical constraints alone might not accomplish. But the legal constraints are not permanent. They depend on the continued life of the people whose protection they provide, on the continued capacity of those people to bring and sustain legal actions that deter disclosure. The passage of time changes this calculus in ways that the passage of time always changes legal calculations, and the aging of the specific individuals whose private assessments by Diana constitute the most sensitive non-deployed material means that the legal landscape around that material is evolving. Burrell understands this. He has demonstrated, across the commercial career that followed Diana's death, a sophisticated understanding of the legal and commercial environment that governs the deployment of the material he holds. An understanding reflected in the timing of specific disclosures, in the form in which specific material has been presented, and in the distinctions between what has been disclosed and what has not. The understanding is not the understanding of an innocent who is unaware of the constraints that operate on what he can say. It is the understanding of someone who has been operating within those constraints professionally for 2 decades, and who has managed the specific content of his disclosures in the light of his understanding of where the legal lines run. The intelligence that Diana's inner circle possessed about the institution and the people who ran it was, across the years of her most politically active engagement with her own situation, genuinely significant. The Morton book demonstrated what one portion of it looked like when disclosed. The Panorama interview demonstrated what a second portion looked like. The combination of the two produced sufficient political disruption that the palace's response, the managed acceleration of the divorce, the removal of the HRH title, the systematic management of Diana's post-royal public profile, reflected a genuine institutional assessment that the intelligence she possessed and was willing to deploy was a real threat to the institution's interests. Burrell had access to the intelligence that had not been deployed through Morton and Panorama, the portions that Diana had shared with him, rather than with the journalist or the broadcaster, in the specific register of the most private conversations. The portions shared in the most private register are, by definition, the portions that the public deployment of the Morton book and the Panorama interview had not reached, the portions that Diana had withheld from those deployments, for reasons that the most private register of private communication would have contained, and that the most trusted person in her private world would have known. He knows what she withheld. He knows why she withheld it, if she told him. He knows the names and the incidents and the specific assessments that the Morton book and the Panorama interview stopped short of. The stopping short was Diana's decision, made for reasons that the decision's outcomes reflected. The Morton book produced a constitutional crisis, the Panorama interview produced a divorce, and the decision about what to withhold from each deployment was the decision of someone who understood the consequences of deployment and was managing the deployment accordingly. What she managed not to deploy, and told only to Burrell, is the material whose future remains genuinely uncertain. His management of it across the years since her death has been governed by the commercial and legal calculations that his professional situation has required. Those calculations have produced the selection of deployments that the public record contains. They have not produced a complete deployment. The complete deployment has not happened. Whether it will happen, in what form, and when, is a question that the calculations governing it have not yet resolved into a public answer. The question sits with Burrell. It has been sitting with him since 1997. It will sit with him until he decides it should not, or until the conditions that make the deciding possible expire with him. The intelligence Diana gave him was the most valuable resource his 17 years of service produced. He knows what it is worth. He has known since at least the year he signed the first book deal. The question of what he has not yet told is the question that everyone who has studied Diana's life and understood the character of what she communicated privately has been asking since 2003. The asking has not produced an answer. The answer is in the possession of a man from Grassmore who crossed a distance that most people in Grassmore would never contemplate crossing, and who found, at the end of the crossing, that the most valuable thing the crossing had given him was not the proximity to greatness he had sought, but the specific, deployable knowledge of someone else's private truth. He is deploying it still, on his schedule, in his formats, for his commercial returns. Diana called him her rock. She did not know what the rock was made of. There is a man in Britain today who knows more about Diana, Princess of Wales, than any living person outside her immediate family. He knows what she said in private about the people who managed her life. He knows the specific content of her private fears and her private hopes and her private assessments of the world she inhabited. He knows the things she confided in the most intimate register of private trust, the things she told the person she had decided was the one person she could tell, in the belief that the telling would stay with that person and go no further. He has been selling that knowledge for 20 years. The selling is the fact around which every other fact in Paul Burrell's story arranges itself, the fact that determines how the 17 years of apparently devoted service are understood, how the tears on the Old Bailey steps are understood, how the television appearances and the documentaries and the books and the magazine features are understood. Everything else in the story is context. The selling is the story, the context is important and deserves the attention this account has given it. The background that produced a man capable of the sustained performance of loyalty that 17 years of Diana's household required. The specific dynamics of a relationship between a woman who needed someone to trust and a man who understood the value of being that person. The palace's failure to manage its own response to his commercial activities effectively, the legal and commercial environment that shaped the form of the deployments. These things matter. They help explain how the story reached the point it reached. They do not change the central fact. He sold Diana's secrets. He sold them knowingly, having made the commercial calculation that that the selling was worth more than the keeping, having managed the deployment of the selling with the professional sophistication of someone who had been thinking about the calculation for longer than the public timeline of the commercial career suggests. He sold them in ways that violated the specific terms of the trust in which they had been given to him, not the general terms of professional discretion that royal household service imposes, but the specific terms of the personal trust that Diana had extended to the specific person she had decided was her rock. The personal trust is the category that matters most in any honest assessment of what Burrell did. Royal household staff sell information about the households they have served. It is not a practice that the palace approves of, or that the specific people affected by it welcome, but it is a practice with a long history and a coherent commercial logic that makes it genuinely difficult to characterize as uniquely reprehensible. The footman who gives a tabloid a story about the household's domestic arrangements is doing something that the palace considers a betrayal and that any straightforward ethical accounting would confirm is a breach of professional obligation. Burrell was not doing what the footman does. He was doing something considerably more specific and considerably more personal. He was selling the private communications of a woman who had trusted him not in the general register of professional trust, but in the specific register of personal confidence, who had told him things she had told no one else, because she had concluded, on the basis of sustained observation across 17 years, that he was the person capable of receiving those communications and holding them in the way that personal confidence requires. The thing that personal confidence requires from its recipient is the one thing that Burrell's commercial career has consistently demonstrated he was not prepared to provide: the unconditional maintenance of the privacy that the confidence was designed to protect, regardless of the commercial value of the material the privacy contains, and regardless of the financial circumstances of the person maintaining it. This is not an impossible standard. It is not a standard that requires the absence of any other interests or any awareness of commercial value. It is simply the standard that the specific nature of personal confidence imposes. The understanding that when someone trusts you with their most private communications on the basis of their belief in your discretion, the discretion is owed unconditionally, and the conditionality of your financial circumstances is not a factor that diminishes what you owe. The people in Diana's life who understood this, who had been trusted with her private communications, and who maintained the privacy of those communications, regardless of the commercial value of the material, and regardless of the financial circumstances of their own lives, are the people the historical record knows the least about. They did not sell. They did not speak. They maintained the privacy that the trust required, and they maintained it in the face of the same commercial environment that Burrell operated in, the same anniversary cycles, the same publisher appetite, the same broadcaster demand for insider material, the same financial pressures that the post-royal world's end of formal employment imposed on the people whose professional identities had been constructed around Diana's household. Some of them were not wealthy. Some of them had the same financial incentives that Burrell had. Some of them had access to material of comparable sensitivity. They did not sell. The fact of their not selling is as significant for an understanding of what was possible as the fact of Burrell's selling is for an understanding of what happened. Loyalty, in the specific sense that Diana needed from the people she trusted with her private self, was possible. It was demonstrated by the people who maintained it. It was not demonstrated by the man she called her rock, who maintained the performance of it for 17 years and then disclosed, through the successive commercial deployments that followed her death, that the performance and the substance had not been the same thing. The specific harm this caused is not simply the harm to Diana's estate or to the privacy of her private communications. It is the retroactive harm to the trust she extended, the harm to the specific act of courage that trusting someone completely represents, the harm done to the memory of a woman who was lonely and frightened in ways that public loneliness and public fear rarely fully communicate, who found in the relationship with her butler the specific relief of believing that there was one person in her world who would always be on her side without calculating what being on her side was worth. She was wrong about this. The wrongness was not her failure. She assessed the available evidence, and she drew a reasonable conclusion, and the reasonable conclusion was wrong, because the evidence had been managed to produce a reasonable conclusion that was wrong. The management was skilled enough to sustain the conclusion across 17 years. That is not a comfortable thing to say about a man who was present for a significant portion of the final years of a significant woman's life. It is the accurate thing to say. The accurate thing about Paul Burrell is that he was, across the 17 years of the service, sufficiently good at the performance of loyalty that the woman he was performing it for went to her death believing it was real. And that in the years following her death, he disclosed, through the successive commercial deployments of the material the performance had accumulated, that the performance was the more complete account of the relationship than the substance. Diana wanted a rock. She found someone who knew how to look like one. The looking lasted for 17 years. The rock lasted for as long as the looking required it to. When the looking was no longer required, when the principle was gone, and the professional relationship that had made the performance necessary had dissolved, what remained was not the rock, but the man from Grassmoor, with an archive of private communications and a calculation about their commercial value that he had been developing, at whatever level of conscious intention the development required, across the years that the performance had sustained. The calculation produced a royal duty. It produced the subsequent books, and the television appearances, and the documentary participations, and the magazine features, and the anniversary cycle deployments. It produced, across 20 years, a commercial enterprise built on the private communications of a woman who had believed the man she was communicating with was her most trusted confidant, and who had made that belief the condition of the communication's candor. The candor is what was sold. The trust is what made the candor possible. The selling is what the trust was used for. She called him her rock. The accounting is complete. The rock was not a rock. The trust was used. The woman who extended it deserved better from the man she extended it to, and the man she extended it to knew this and chose differently. The choice is the record. The record is permanent. The accounting that the permanent record requires is the one this account has attempted, not the accounting of a villain whose villainy simplifies the story, but the accounting of a man whose specific choices about a specific resource produced specific consequences for specific people, whose choices were made with awareness of what they were and what they cost the person whose trust had made them possible. He chose, she trusted. He chose differently from what the trust required. That is Paul Burrell's story. The rest is commercial activity. Paul Burrell married Maria Carmen Costas in 1984, 3 years before he transferred from the Queen's household to the Wales household at Kensington Palace. The marriage produced 2 sons and lasted, formally, for 30 years, one of the longer marital durations in the record of people whose public lives generated sustained press coverage across the same period. It survived the Wales years, the death of Diana, the theft investigation, the trial, the book, the television appearances, and the successive commercial deployments of the material that the years at Kensington Palace had produced. It survived, across those decades, with the quiet durability of a domestic arrangement whose existence the press noted periodically, and whose internal character the press was not given the material to report on with any specificity. Maria was not a public figure. She had married a footman who became a butler, who became, through the specific combination of his employer's death and his own commercial calculation, one of the most recognizable figures in the British celebrity landscape of the early 2000s. The transformation of her husband's public profile across the years following Diana's death was not something she had married into or prepared for. She had married a man whose professional world was the managed discretion of royal household service, whose public identity was that of someone who specifically did not have a public identity, and whose life outside the service was the domestic life of a man with a home in Cheshire and a family that the service's demands made the secondary rather than primary commitment of his daily existence. The demands of the commercial career that followed the service were demands of a different character. The book tours, the television appearances, the international media engagements, the documentary participations, the celebrity culture that the I'm a Celebrity appearance had placed him within, these were demands that produced a public presence whose requirements were the inverse of the royal household's requirements. The household had required invisibility. The commercial career required visibility. The household had required silence. The commercial career required speech. The household had required the subordination of his personality to the requirements of the role. The commercial career required the deployment of his personality as the commercial product's primary asset. The person living inside this transformation and watching it from the domestic position of a wife who had married someone in the first category was watching something whose character the marriage had not been designed to accommodate. The specific adjustments that a domestic life built around royal household service requires, the absences, the discretion, the professional subordination that shapes the person who performs it, are adjustments that a particular kind of domestic partnership can manage over time. The adjustments that a commercial celebrity career built on the intimate disclosures of a dead employer requires are adjustments of a fundamentally different character, and the management of them within the same domestic partnership requires a flexibility and a tolerance that the original arrangement had not necessarily produced. Maria had signed on for Paul Burrell, the royal household employee. She was living with Paul Burrell, the Diana celebrity, whose commercial existence required him to perform in public the intimacy of a relationship with a dead woman, whose memory was now his primary commercial asset. The performance was not simply professional, it was the totality of his public identity, the thing that his name signified, and the thing that any public engagement with him was designed to access. His marriage, his domestic life, his children, these were features of the private life that existed alongside the commercial existence rather than as its substance. The commercial existence was Diana. It was always Diana. Every appearance, every interview, every book, every television program was an appearance and interview and book and program about Diana, about his relationship to her, his knowledge of her, his experience of her, the specific intimacy that 17 years of daily service had produced and that the commercial enterprise had been built to deploy. He was, in the public identity that the commercial career had constructed, almost entirely defined by his relationship to someone else, a someone else who was dead and who was therefore available to be defined by his account of her, without the complication of her own account competing with his. The marriage became public as a subject in the specific way that celebrity marriages become public as subjects, when the celebrity's public identity creates a context in which the private life becomes a dimension of the public story. Journalists who were covering Burrell's commercial career found in the marriage a natural element of the story, the domestic backdrop against which the Diana devotion was staged, the evidence of an ordinary life conducted alongside the extraordinary professional one, the specific human interest of a family man from Cheshire who had been at the center of the most significant royal story of the decade. The domestic framing served the commercial narrative. It provided Burrell with a specific kind of ordinariness that the celebrity context required him to demonstrate. The evidence that behind the devotion to Diana and the appearances on television and the books about royalty, there was a recognizable private person living a recognizable private life with a wife and children in Cheshire. The ordinariness was genuine in its facts. The wife was real, the children were real, the Cheshire house was real, and the genuineness of the facts sustained the framing, even when the framing was being used to serve the commercial narrative rather than to describe the actual character of the domestic situation. The domestic situation's actual character became more complicated across the years of the commercial career, in ways that the public framing did not capture and that the people involved in the situation were not communicating to the press. Marriages are not sustained across decades of significant professional transformation without adaptation, and the adaptation that the transformation from royal household employee to Diana celebrity required of both people inside the marriage was not always adaptation that the marriage's existing terms supported. In 2015, Paul Burrell gave an interview to a publication in which he described his sexual orientation in terms that placed him outside the exclusively heterosexual category in which his public identity had always been presented. The disclosure was made in the specific register of someone who had been managing a dimension of their private identity within a public presentation that did not accommodate it, and who had reached the point where the management was no longer the most sustainable available option. The disclosure produced, in the immediate press response, the specific quality of coverage that public disclosures of this kind produce, coverage that processed the information through the frame of the celebrity story that already surrounded him, positioning the disclosure as a development in the Paul Burrell narrative rather than as a piece of information about a private individual's private identity. The coverage was not unkind, or was not uniformly unkind, but it was relentless in the way that coverage of people within the celebrity economy is relentless when a development provides new material for the ongoing coverage that the celebrity's public profile sustains. Maria's position in the story was the position of someone who had been living inside the private version of information that the public was now receiving as news. Whatever the specific character of her knowledge of her husband's private identity across the years of the marriage, whatever conversations had or had not occurred, whatever understandings had or had not been reached, whatever the specific texture of a domestic arrangement that had sustained itself across 3 decades, the public version of her domestic situation had been a version that the disclosure now required to be revised. The marriage ended. The formal ending came in the years following the disclosure, through the processes that marriages end through when the people inside them have concluded that the circumstances no longer sustain the continuation. The ending was managed with the same discretion that the marriage itself had been managed with, without public drama, without the competing accounts of irreconcilable differences that divorce proceedings in the celebrity economy sometimes produce, with the quiet dissolution of a domestic arrangement whose private character the parties involved chose to maintain as private, even as the ending became publicly known. What the marriage's trajectory, from the footman's domestic life in 1984 to the celebrity's managed domestic backdrop in the 2000s, to the disclosure in 2015, to the dissolution that followed, tells you about Paul Burrell is what any significant relationship's trajectory tells you about the person inside it. That the management of the relationship across 3 decades required a specific kind of sustained management of public presentation that is distinct from the management of private reality, and that the distance between those two things, in this case as in the Diana case, was more considerable than the public presentation suggested. He managed the public presentation of the marriage the way he managed the public presentation of his relationship to Diana, with the competence that sustained public presentation requires, and with the distance between the presentation and the private reality that the management of public presentations always produces. The competence was genuine, the distance was real. The gap between the presentation and the reality was the gap that significant revelations eventually cross. In Diana's case, the revelation of the gap came through the commercial deployments that followed her death. In the marriage's case, the revelation came through the 2015 disclosure and what followed it. In both cases, the revelation was of something that had been managed rather than resolved, a private reality that the public presentation had been maintaining at a distance rather than representing accurately. The parallel is not an accusation, it is an observation about the specific character of a person who has consistently demonstrated, across the significant relationships of his adult life, the capacity for the sustained management of the distance between public presentation and private reality. The capacity was professionally valuable in the royal household context, where it was the primary professional requirement. It was personally costly in the domestic context, where it accumulated across 3 decades into the specific weight that accumulations of managed distance always produce. Maria Burrell had lived inside the managed distance for 30 years. The living had produced whatever it had produced, the specific knowledge of a marriage from the inside that the people inside it possess, and that nobody outside it can fully access. She did not give interviews about it. She did not produce the account that would have provided the external understanding. Her silence was the silence of someone who had decided that the private was private, regardless of what the public had been told. The irony of that decision, in the context of a marriage to the man who had sold Diana's private communications, is an irony that the record contains without resolving. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, in the company of Dodi Fayed. She had known him for approximately 6 weeks. The relationship had developed with a speed that the people around Diana at the time have described in terms ranging from genuine romantic excitement to something more strategically complicated. The accounts differ, and the differences reflect the specific perspective of each account's source and the specific interest each source had in presenting the relationship in a particular light. Burrell's account of the relationship is among the most significant available, because Burrell was the person Diana communicated with most privately across the weeks of the relationship's development, and because the communications he received during those weeks were the communications of someone who was processing a new and significant experience through the most trusted private channel available to her. He was the person she called. He was the person she spoke to about what was happening, about what she felt, about the specific texture of what the Dodi relationship represented to her in the weeks of the summer of 1997 when it was developing. His public accounts of what those communications contained have been characteristically selective. He has described the relationship in terms that are warm and that position Diana as a woman who was finding genuine happiness in the final weeks of her life. The narrative that serves the most commercially viable version of the story. The narrative that leaves the audience with the specific emotional closure of someone who died happy, rather than someone who died in the midst of a complicated situation whose complexity the 6 weeks did not permit to fully resolve. The warmth of the narrative may be accurate. Diana was, by multiple accounts from people who observed her during the summer of 1997, in a more positive emotional state than she had been in the preceding year, more settled, more energized, more engaged with the forward-looking decisions about her life that the completion of the divorce settlement had made possible. The Dodi relationship, whatever its precise character and whatever its likely trajectory, was a relationship that the available evidence suggests she was experiencing as genuinely pleasurable, and the pleasure was real, regardless of the questions about what the relationship would have become had the crash in Paris not ended the summer. The complexity that Burrell's warmth narrative does not address is the complexity that the relationship's speed, its context, and its specific participants introduced into any honest assessment of what was happening. Dodi Fayed was the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, whose sustained and publicly conducted campaign to obtain British citizenship had been a significant element of British political life across the preceding decade, and whose relationship with the British establishment was, by the summer of 1997, one of mutual and sustained hostility. The question of whether the relationship between Diana and Dodi was entirely separable from the broader context of Mohammed Al-Fayed's political and social ambitions is a question that the people who have studied Diana's life most carefully have consistently found difficult to dismiss. Burrell received Diana's communications about the relationship during the weeks of its development. Those communications are among the most sensitive material his 17 years of service produced. Sensitive not because of the romantic content they contained, but because of what they may have revealed about Diana's own assessment of the relationship's character and context, her own understanding of what she was involved in and what the involvement represented. A woman of Diana's political intelligence and her specific experience of being managed by people whose interests did not align with hers would not have been entirely unaware of the contextual questions that the Dodi relationship raised. Whether she addressed those questions in her private communications to Burrell is something that the portions of those communications he has made public do not resolve. He has not addressed the contextual questions in any of his public accounts. The omission is notable because the contextual questions are central to any complete understanding of what Diana was doing in the final weeks of her life, and the person best positioned to illuminate what she thought she was doing has consistently presented a version of events that addresses the emotional content of the relationship without engaging with its political or strategic dimensions. The emotional content is the commercially viable content. The political and strategic dimensions are the legally and diplomatically sensitive content, the content whose public deployment would require Burrell to position himself in relation to the Al-Fayed family, and the specific claims about Diana's relationship to Dodi that the Al-Fayed family has made publicly and at considerable length across the decades since the crash. Mohammed Al-Fayed's public position on the relationship was that it was a genuine romance whose culmination in marriage had been imminent at the time of Diana's death, and that the crash that killed both Dodi and Diana was not an accident, but a conspiracy organized by forces within the British establishment who found the prospect of Diana's relationship with a Muslim man and her possible pregnancy by him intolerable. These claims were made in the specific register of a man who had lost a son and who found in the conspiracy theory a narrative that served both his grief and his long-standing animosity toward the British establishment. The Stevens inquiry examined these claims and found them not supported by the available evidence. The French investigation reached similar conclusions. The inquest jury in 2008 returned a verdict of unlawful killing caused by grossly negligent driving, a verdict that attributed the deaths to the specific circumstances of the crash without finding the conspiracy that Mohammed al-Fayed had alleged. Burrell's navigation of this landscape has been the most careful of any navigation in his commercial career. He has not endorsed the conspiracy theory in any form that would align him publicly with Mohammed al-Fayed's position. He has not dismissed it in any form that would constitute a public contradiction of claims whose legal sensitivity and whose potential commercial ramifications he appears to have assessed as sufficient grounds for the careful silence he has maintained. The careful silence about the conspiracy theory is consistent with the careful silence about the relationship's contextual dimensions. Both silences serve the same function, the avoidance of the legal and commercial consequences that engaging directly with either would produce. Mohammed al-Fayed's litigious history, his wealth, and his specific sensitivity about anything that contradicts his publicly stated account of his son's relationship to Diana make the territory around the Dodi question among the most legally dangerous in the entire Diana landscape. Burrell has operated around that territory with a consistency that suggests genuine understanding of where the dangerous ground runs. What Diana told him about Dodi in the weeks of the relationship's development, the specific things she said in the private register of the communications she sent to her most trusted confidant, is material whose complete deployment Burrell has not attempted. The deployments he has made, the warmth narrative, the happiness confirmation, the emotional texture of the relationship as she experienced it, are deployments that serve the commercially optimal version of the story without engaging with the dimensions of the material that carry the most legal and diplomatic risk. The dimensions he has not deployed include whatever Diana said about the relationship's pace, the specific speed of its development across 6 weeks, from the first meeting to the yachting holiday, to the photographs that announced the relationship to the world, and what that pace reflected about what each party was seeking from the other in those 6 weeks. A woman of Diana's experience of relationships and her specific understanding of the mechanisms by which people in her orbit managed their proximity to her would not have been unaware of the specific quality of the speed. Whether she discussed that awareness with Burrell is something that only Burrell knows. The dimensions he has not deployed also include whatever Diana communicated about her own understanding of the relationship's likely trajectory, what she thought it was going to become, what she wanted it to become, and whether those two things were the same or different. A woman making decisions about her post-royal life with the political intelligence that Diana consistently demonstrated in the years following the divorce was not navigating the Dodi relationship without some understanding of where it was heading and whether the heading served her own interests. These questions matter not because they diminish the genuine warmth and the genuine pleasure that the available evidence suggests Diana experienced in those final weeks. They matter because they are part of the complete picture of what Diana was doing in the last period of her life, and the complete picture is the picture that the historical record most requires and that Burrell, as the person best positioned to provide it, has most consistently declined to produce. The declining reflects the calculation that has governed the entire commercial career, the assessment of which portions of the material can be deployed without producing legal consequences that outweigh the commercial returns, and which portions need to be reserved for either future deployment when the legal landscape shifts, or permanent non-deployment when the legal risks are assessed as permanently prohibitive. The Dodi material is in the second category. It sits there alongside whatever other portions of Diana's private communications have been assessed as too legally sensitive or too diplomatically costly to deploy in any commercial format available to Burrell in the current legal environment. The assessment may change. Legal landscapes change. The people whose existence provides the basis for legal claims that currently deter disclosure are not permanent features of the landscape. Mohammed al-Fayed died in 2023, which changed one dimension of the calculation around the Dodi material. Other changes may follow, in the natural way that the passage of time changes the landscape around sensitive historical material. Burrell is in his mid-60s. He has been managing the calculation that governs the deployment of what he knows about Diana for more than 2 decades. The calculation has produced the commercial enterprise that a royal duty initiated and that the subsequent deployments have sustained. It has not produced the complete account of what he knows. Whether the complete account is ever produced, whether by Burrell himself, by his estate, or through some other mechanism that the future's unpredictable developments might create, is a question that the calculation has not yet resolved into a final answer. The final answer is with him. The Dodi dimension is the clearest example of what the final answer's components look like: the sensitive material, the legal landscape, the commercial calculation, and the man who sits at the center of all three, managing the deployment of what he knows about a woman whose trust in him was the most complete trust she extended to anyone outside her own family, and whose complete account of what that trust produced remains, more than 2 decades after her death, the most significant untold story in the history of the institution she spent her adult life inside. He knows it, he holds it, he deploys it selectively. The selection is the calculation. The calculation is Paul Burrell. The woman who trusted him took the full account with her to Paris. He kept the rest.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.